With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah Daf Chav Beis. We left off on Daf Chav Beis on top of the Amid. We're going to begin to learn the Mishnah, the din of Sukah Hamid Duvleles. And as we will see, we have a Machlokes Amoyroim. Pashut, what's the meaning of the Sukah Hamid Duvleles to better understand the first halacha in the Mishnah? The Mishnah mentions the need of having more shade than sunlight. We will see whether this is a second din or whether this is a hemshech of the Sukah Hamid Duvleles. That's part of the Machlokes Amoyroim. And then the third din in the Mishnah will be that if a Sukah has such thick schach that one cannot see the stars through it, one might think that this would be too house-like. And as we learned above, sitting in a house, even if theoretically the roof, the ceiling fits all of the criteria of schach, nevertheless you cannot use your house for a sukkah. And one would think that someone would confuse thick schach like a house. The Mishnah paskins that we don't say so. And even if it's that thick, you cannot see the stars through it, the sukkah still remains kosher. Now the main chiddush, the main novelty that we will have on Daf Chav Beis is a new halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and that's called chavoit remi, lower and cast, lower and put together. And as we'll speak this out when we learn the Gemara, it's to a certain degree similar to the concept of good achis, similar to the concept of pi tikra yored v'soisim, but b'chlal not the same. Again, a very unique new halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and the Gemara is going to limit the halacha l'Moshe Sinai of chavoit remi, that sometimes we can lower part of a roof and align it with that which is underneath it. That's only if that which you are lowering has a tefach thickness or more. If it's wide a tefach, not thick, wide a tefach or more. If it doesn't even have a tefach of width, as we continuously go back and forth from dinim of tumas oil to the dinim of sukkah, just like it's not considered the oil when a geya tuma, it's not going to be considered oil enough for us to apply the law of chavoit remi. And the Gemara is going to challenge that, but ultimately we will come to that maskana. Now, what we will also bring back is something that we just mentioned on Daf Yud Ches, and that's the law that when you have a mavui she'einu mefulish, and midrabanan, you have to make some sort of heket at its entrance. That's the beginning of Masechtas Eruvin, by putting elechi or a kaira. And we're going to learn very unusual scenarios of kairas, very unusual cases where you have a kaira that really doesn't at first glance meet the minimum width of the kaira, and yet it's going to be a kosher kaira. We're going to see whether we are using the din of chavoit remi in those halachas or not. We're going to have a fantastic concept, which is that when there is sunlight in the size of only a zuz by the schach, there's an opening in the schach, as you go down to the floor of the sukkah, so the rule is that sunlight spreads as it moves further from the source. This is a beautiful concept. And that's going to help us clarify when we are learning in the Mishnayos, whether we're going to have today, like we mentioned, the din that you have to have more shade than sunlight. When we're going to infer, what about if it's 50-50? When we're going to go back to the first Mishnah on Daf Beis and make another inference from what the Mishnah says over there, there's going to be an apparent contradiction, and we're going to clarify it as, are we looking at the schach area or whether we are looking at the ground area in the sukkah? And God willing, if we'll have time, we will start or learn the Mishnah on Daf Chav Beis, Amid Beis, that's speaking about a sukkah that's built on a wagon, and a sukkah that's built on top of a ship. And even though we learned yesterday on Daf Chav Aleph Amid Beis, according to one of the understandings in our Mishnah, that if a sukkah completely lacks fixedness, it's invalid. However, if the sukkah is metaltel, but it's going to be more fixed than the Mishnah we learned on Chaf Aleph Amid Beis, as we'll learn, which is a sukkah that's built on top of a wagon or on top of a ship, it will be kosher, versus a sukkah that's built on top of a tree, or a sukkah that's built on top of an animal. We will see the problem over there, and as we know that midrabanan, you may not climb a tree on Shabbos, you may not even lean on a tree on Shabbos. You may not ride an animal on Shabbos, how that will affect the kashrus of the sukkah and much, much more. Let us start on the Chav Beis Amud Aleph, all the way on top of the Amid, starting with the new Mishnah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol na'im b'dvarim. Says the Mishnah, this is the words that has to be clarified. If you have a Sukah hamid duv lelis, we'll leave that for the Gemara. Now the next line is either a continuation of this case or it's a new case. V'shetzilasa meruba mechamasa. If you have a Sukah that has more shade than sunlight, so says the Mishnah, it's kosher. And now another law, whether this is the second or the third law of the Mishnah, ha mu'uva kimin bayis, if the sukkah is thickly covered, mamish like the roof, ceiling of a house, how thick, even though you cannot see the stars when you are under the schach. And again, you would think that people will confuse this with a bias. And if this will be kosher, they might erroneously that a house is also a kosher sukkah, even though the schach there theoretically meets all of the three rules of the schach, but by a house it's for sure never kosher if something was built for a house. So the Chazal did not make such a decree, and they say that even though it's that thick, yet nevertheless the sukkah is ksheira. Good. And now, Pasha, to understand what is the opening case of the Mishnah, my midduv lelis. Machloikes Rav and Shmuel. Amar Rav, that the first case of our Mishnah is Sukah Aniyah, a Sukah whose schach is very meager. In other words, the layer of schach is very skinny. Not only is it very skinny, but there are many gaps in that skinny layer. And as we will see in the Mishnah, that Rav understands the first and second to be part of the same case. A sukkah hamidduv lelis, even though the schach is that meager, the Mishnah says, as long as at the end of the day you have more shade than sunlight, then the sukkah is kosher. I don't care how meager, how poor the schach is. That's the way Rav teaches the words hamidduv lelis, and as we'll see in a moment, it comes from the shayrish of dal. Dalus, it's poor, it's meager. Shmuel says no. The Mishnah is introducing the concept of kana oila and kana yored. So guys, if you have schach that's made out of reeds, or let's use now the word bamboo sticks, and one is high and one is low. One is high, one is low, not one directly over the other. No. One is exactly where you have two on the top and there's a gap in between. The one underneath is exactly in between the gap. In other words, you have one on top and on the side one below. If they all would have been on the same line, they would have been adjacent to each other. And here Shmuel has a tremendous chiddush. Now that every second reed is on another height, because of the layout of the schach, there is more sun than shade. If you would view them to be all put on the same level, then there would have been more shade than sunlight. And that's the gewaldige chiddush of Shmuel's understanding of the Mishnah, that halachically we view them to be on the same level. Halachically, therefore, there's more shade than sunlight. And let's continue reading inside the Gemara. So says the Gemara, according to Rav's understanding of the word midduv leles, then the Mishnah, by writing Sukah midduv leles, and then writing V'shetzilasa meruba mechamasa, Tani Chada is only teaching us the same rule, that the Sukkah always needs to have more shade than sunlight. According to Shmuel, who says midduv leles, the word in English is staggered. So according to Shmuel, the Mishnah is actually writing two separate dinim, because like we just mentioned, when it's midduv lelis, there is actually physically more sun than shade. There's more sunlight than shade. So that will be the only exception where we don't need to have more shade than sunlight. And now the Gemara expounds further. According to Rav, Tani Chada, what's the Chada? Sukah midduv lelis. And what's the meaning of midduv lelis? Like we said, meager, and that comes from the words middul deles, miloshan dal. I don't care how thin and how many gaps you have in this skinny schach, as long as as long as at the end of the day, when you are in the sukkah, when you are under the schach, there's more shade than sunlight, then the sukkah is going to be kosher. Shmuel, Tani Tarte, Shmuel understands that miduvlelis means a staggeredly a layered schach. My miduvlelis, it comes from the words mivulbeles, which means staggered. So one reed on top, one reed on bottom. The one on the bottom is exactly in between the gaps of the ones on the top. And therefore the Mishnah is actually teaching us 3 dinim, or if you're just focusing on the Reisha of the Mishnah, there are 2 dinim. V'tarte ketani, rule number 1, Sukah mivul beles, that's the staggered Sukah, it's kesheira. There's going to be more sun than shade light. That will be the rule of the Mishnah, that halachically we align them all on the same level. As we will see, we lower the top schach to the bottom. And once you look at it halachically that way, if taka physically they would have been on the same level, it would have blocked more sun, and there would have been more shade than sunlight, and therefore the sukkah is kosher, even though de facto there is more sun, then there's more sunlight than shade. And then the Mishnah says another halacha that otherwise, other than in the case of a staggeredly layered schach, you have to have more shade than sunlight, and only then will the sukkah be kosher. Now, why is it that we lower the top into the bottom? What gives us the right to do that? So Abaya explaining Shmuel's Shita, Shmuel's Taich in the Mishnah, is connecting the first line in the Mishnah to the din that we learned so many times together, to the din of Lavut. And indeed, Loi Shanu, that we are allowed halachically to view them on the same level, Elo she'ein bein zeh lo zeh, we're speaking about vertically, that the space between the upper and the lower, milmayla lamato, milmato lamayla, is less than 3 tfachim, and the words that Rashi uses, and we have this in many other areas in halacha, it's called royin. That means we look at it as if it's all on the same level because of the din of lavut. Aval yesh bein zeh lo zeh gimel tfachim, but as long as there's 3 tfachim or more vertically, so psula, because you don't have lavut, you cannot say royin. If de facto there is more sun, light than shade, then the sukkah is going to be pas. So says Abaya in the Shita of Shmuel. And comes along Rava, this is what we're learning new today. Amar Rava says Rava, no. Or really it's Rava, Amar. Generally when the second argues with the first, when it's not a new topic, the Amar comes after the name. Rava Amar, no, afilu yesh bein zeh lo zeh shloisha tfachim. It's not necessarily connected to lavut, even if it's 3 tfachim or more of a gap, looking at the vertical higher layer and lower layer. Nami lo yamaran. We did not say that the sukkah is invalid. There'll be times that Abaya is right, but you know when? Ela b'she'ein bigagoy tefach. Only if the width of each reed is not wide a tefach. If it's not wide a tefach, then the only way you can put them halachically on the same level is only by using lavud, and therefore you have to have less than 3 tefach. But the moment aval yesh bigagoy tefach, but if the width of the higher level of reeds is a tefach or more, then even if the space vertically between the higher and the lower layer of schach is 3 tfachim, more than 3 tfachim, we'll see a lot more than 3 tfachim, nevertheless, the Mishnah will still be ksheira. And again, it's no matter how far apart they are. There's no limit to that. Now, there are other limits. Don't forget, guys, that schach cannot be placed, according to the Chachamim, above 20 amas. The lower layer cannot be placed under 10 tfachim. These are limits not connected to our halacha. And why is that? So here are the words. Why? Chavoit means lower, and remi means cast, place. Chavoit remi. So if you have a picture, if you can just put your hands one over the other, so if you can just imagine, if you were to physically lower it, the top kanim would fit in between the gaps of the lower ones, they would all align, then we say that's not the din of lavut. That's the din called chavoit remi, lower and place it all together. However, what Rav is emphasizing is that yes, there is a halacha l'moshe misina called chavoit remi, but for you to lower the top gag, it has to be a chashav gag. It has to be an oil, it has to be a covering. And as we find in Hilchas Tumah V'Tara, that what is considered an oil enough, let's say to convey Tumas oil, it has to be a gag that has the width and the length of a tefach. Less than that, it's not chashuv. Similarly, Chavay Tremi is only if there's a tefach. Okay. And Amar Rava, Mino Aminole, law. How do I know? Where do I get that what I just said? That the chi is beitefach, only then do we say Chavay Tremi. Speaking about the width of a tefach. But the chi leis bay, but if you don't have the width of a tefach, I'll tell you where I see this. And I find this not by Sukah. I find this in a Mishnah in Masechtas Alois concerning Tumah and Tarom. And here again, if you have a picture, or you can just picture it in your mind. Here again, just guys, what we're speaking about here is a 2-story home, and the ceiling, the roof of the first story is not completed. Not completed doesn't only mean that there's no plaster over it, but the way the ceiling of the first story, which becomes later the floor of the second story, the way it's made is first they had beams going only in one direction, and there are gaps in between the beams. And the same thing is that the roof of the second story, which is the roof of the house, the ceiling of the house, is also made the same way. So they are mid-construction. And here there are two options. Option number one is that the beams that are going in one direction from both the first floor, that means the roof of the first floor and the roof of the second floor, are exactly one over the other, and the gaps are over the other. Or the other option in the Mishnah is when they're staggered in a way like we have in our Mishnah, when they're exactly not over each other. When the gap that you have when you're standing on the ground floor, when you look up, the gap in between the two beams, the beam that's put on the roof of the second story is exactly aligned in between that. And here it's a very easy Mishnah that is giving you this case for the classical dinim of Tumas oil. That when you have Tumah underneath a roof, any other item that is susceptible to becoming Tameh will become Tameh, will acquire Tumah, because there's enough of a mace that could convey Tumas mace. And let's read the Mishnah inside. So it says, all this is Rava's Raya that Chavay Tremi is only said when there's a width of a tefach. That Tanach learned in Alois, Koiras Abayis Vo Aliyah. You have beams that are on top, right, of the people that are standing in the ground floor. It's not a fully built house. We're in the middle of construction. There are only beams, and there are gaps in between these beams. The beams are only going in one direction. If you have a picture, you'll see it. If not, you can imagine it in our minds. And the same thing is that the second story also has now a roof that's built on top of the second story, which is the roof for the entire house. There's also beams only going in one direction, and there are gaps in between it. In neither of these roofs or ceilings, and again, the roof of story number one is really what will become later the floor of story number two. She'ein alei ma'azeva, you don't have plaster over it, and it's not just about plaster, but that means that there are holes, not just a hole, but across the entire length you have an opening. So like this, case number one, if the top beams are exactly over the bottom beams, and now tuma tachas achas mihem, when they are directly over each other, and there's a source of tuma, either there's a source of tuma on the ground, so it's under the beam of floor number one, or if there's tuma on top of it, and it's under the beam that's going across story number two. So only, says the Mishnah, tachtah, only items, adam, kalim, oichlin, and mashkin, items that are susceptible to becoming tummy, that are under that beam, only under that beam, they will become tummy. Because that beam is viewed as a oil for itself. However, bein hatachtoina le'elyoina, what happens if the source of tuma is on top of the roof of story number one, under roof number two? Here again, only beineim, only another item that's also on the second story will become tummy. Weiter, al gabeho al yoina, if you have a source of tuma on top of the beams on the roof of the second story, so then only that which is over it is tamei, kinegda ad l'rikiya tamei, because there's nothing stopping it, and underneath it nothing is tamei, because why would the tuma go down when it's on top of something that's mafsik? Case number 2. What happens if the way the beams were placed, the beams that are going on the top story are placed exactly over the gaps of the lower one, which is similar to the case of our Mishnah that we were calling the case of the staggered according to Shmuel. So here there's a Gavaldik Chiddush. Says the Mishnah that Tuma Tachteyen, that if Tuma's under any, I don't care if it's under the second story or if there's Tuma under the first story, we don't say only items under that same board as Tamei. No, that's the word. Tachas Kulan Tamei. If you have, let's say, a Keli that's on the other side of the house, it will also become Tamei. But it's not under the same beam. I don't care. Halachically, we view now all of the beams to be aligned with each other. That's the din of Chavoit Remi. So now you have one large roof, and that's the din of a Tumas oil. That if you have the source under any part of the roof, so any other item that's susceptible to becoming Tamei under the same roof, I don't care how big the roof is in the same room, it will all acquire Tuma. Mamish, in other words, since they are staggered in a way that Elyonis is Kebein Hatachtoinos, you Keilu lower the top ones and they fit in between the lower ones, and you have now one large roof. Okay, and then the Mishnah gives other cases. Al Gabeim, therefore, if the Tuma is on top of any of them, so it's as if it's on top of the roof of the house. So Kenegdan Al Nakiya Tami. That's the din of Chavoit Remi as we find it in Tumas Oil. And now, all this is Rava quoting, and we know that there is a Braisa that adds a detail to this Mishnah. And V'tani Allah, the Bedvaram Amurim. When do we say that what? That all of the rules of the Mishnah are correct only when the beams are a tefach wide. Bizman sheyesh b'neim tefach u'b'neim p'seach tefach. The width of the beams are a tefach. Now, guys, if we have to use the word Chavoit Remi, so obviously the space in between the lower ones have to be a tefach wide to allow the beams of the top one halachically to be viewed as if it's underneath it. It has to fit there. It has to be able to physically fit there for us to say that royin, for us to say the din of Chavoit Remi. But if the width of these beams are not wide a tefach, so then we don't align them all. Then tuma tachas achas mihen, only that tachtei tamei. But beneim va'al gabeim istar. In other words, since we cannot say Chavoit Remi, why is that? Because the width of the beams are not a tefach. So then we go back to viewing every beam as an oil for itself. That's only if the oil has a tefach. Guys, don't forget. So if the bottom oil has a tefach, but let's say the space in between it doesn't have a tefach, which means that the higher beams are not a tefach wide, then the higher beams are not lowered. If the higher beams are not lowered, then something that's under the beam to the right, only other items under that beam becomes tamei, but we don't align and say that the whole roof becomes viewed as one oil. Clear? That's a beferish Mishnah. Okay, so now Alma we see, concludes Rava, no one will debate this. But this is a din only concerning Tumas oil. The Chiddush of Rava is that he's linking Tumas oil to the din of Schacht or din of a Sukah. That ki is bei tefach, only when the top, when the beams above have the width of a tefach, so they are considered chashuv by themselves. Then we apply the halacha l'moshe misinei of Chavoit. We lower them rimi, and we lay them out inside the gaps of the lower ones, and they become halachically one wide roof ceiling. However, but the moment the ones that you're trying to lower don't have the width of a tefach, then lo yaminin and Chavoit Remi, indeed shmamina. And again, the chiddush here is that the same will be here by schach. All of this is explaining Shmuel, who says Sukah midduv leles means a staggered schach. And as long as each kana is a tefach wide, we're not bound by lavud. Beyond lavud, we can still kasher the sukkah, even though de facto there's more sunlight than shade. But because of the halacha l'moshe misinei Chavoit Remi, since we use that, since Chavoit Remi blocks out more sunlight, then the sukkah becomes kosher. So, Rabbi, yes.
Abaye didn't know that's halacha.
Abaye will see in a moment, perhaps did not agree that Abaye did not know this halacha. Even if we challenge Rava, then we say Chavoit Remi, even if it's less than a tefach, then for sure we should always say Chavoit Remi. You have a good question, Tzvika. I don't think he didn't know this halacha. Maybe he didn't say this halacha is used b'chlal by Sukah. Maybe. Then
Rabbi,
yes.
We just learned it in this Mishnah where we said that the boards and the space have to exactly evenly align.
Correct.
So applying that to Sukah, it sounds like it would be the same idea. You need it to exactly evenly align, which is like seems kind of
No, Danny. No. I don't word it that way. Let's say the gaps in the lower layer is wider than the thickness, than the width of the sukkah on the top. And if you were to lower it, it wouldn't be squeezed in there, but still, when the moment the schach is all on one layer, it blocks out more sunlight. You don't have the sunlight going in between them. All we want to do, Danny, is to have enough space and the gaps in the... They have to fit in, meaning that we don't want for the bottom ones to be too close to each other. But if the bottom layer is laid out with greater gaps, you lower it, and even if there's still space from both sides, doesn't matter. Will there be more shade or will there be more sunlight? That's what we're looking for. Okay, now here comes the big challenge. So Yosef Rav Kahana v'ka'amar lahashmaitz. Rav Kahana is repeating that which he heard from Rav. And Avashi says, hold on. Are you always limiting Chavay Tremi to a tefach? Listen, guys, Ravashi had the same Mishnah in Alois, he had the same Brais, so he knows that by Tumas oil, yes, you only lower it if the top beams have the width of a tefach. Yes, but are we saying it by always? Lav dafka? Maybe by Yasuka we can say Chavay Tremi even if it doesn't have a tefach. And here is this proof. For Hatanya, I'll show you a Brais where l'chu'ura we are also using Chavay Tremi, and even when there isn't the width of a tefach. Now, guys, we have a mavoi she'ena mefulish. We have a mavoi which is called a cul-de-sac. That means that you have an alleyway or a small street that is closed from all three sides. It's closed in the back. It's only opened from the opening of this alleyway into the Reshus Harabim. And as we learned in the beginning of Eruvin, that midrabanan, for you to be allowed to carry in the mavoi, not from the chatzar to the mavoi. For that you have to make a shit of mavois. But even an item that bein hashmashos was already in the mavoi, for you to be able to carry a daladamas or more in that mavoi, you have to section off the mavoi, not completely. You don't even need a tzuras ha-pesach. Suffice to have either a lechi or a koira. And this Brais is going to speak about the din of a koira. So this cross beam, right, as we'll see, has to go from one side to the other. And the beginning of Eruvin is you can't place it above Esrem Amo, according to the Chachamim. That's where Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. We're going to be focusing on what happens. We had the mention of this Brais on Daf Yud Ches. If the koira doesn't go all the way across, if it almost goes all the way across. So let's begin the various cases. Koira, if the koira is leaving, it's connected to the wall on the right, and it's going to the wall on the left, but the eino negas b'koisel doesn't go all the way. There is still a gap between the koira and the other side of and the wall. Or if you had two koiros, achas yoitza mikoisel zeh, achas yoitza mikoisel zeh, but the eino gois zu bezu, but they didn't touch one the other. So here we're going to begin with the din of lavut. If it's pachus mishloisha, if the gap is less than 3 tvachim, ein tzarach lavi koira cheres, you don't have to complete it by bringing a third koira. Why lavut? We view it as if it's annexed. If it's shloisha or more, the gap is 3 tvachim or more, then tzarach lavi koira cheres. And this is here again, guys. I know we spoke about this in Eruvin. It's good every now and then to review that there is one Tana, Rashbag, who holds that lavud is about less than 4 tvachim. Not less than 3 tvachim. Applying it over here, we also had it in Sukah. The same concept of lavud, but I hold it's about 4 tvachim. If it's less than 4 tvachim, the gap, then you're good. Then you don't have to bring another koida to correct it. Right? If it's 4, if the gap is 4 or more, then tzarach lavi koida acheres. Weiter in the Brais. Now this we just learned on Daf Yud Ches. Now we're having a new din. What's the new din? Now let me say it by heart. Really, the koida should have a tefach width, and also the koida should be strong enough to be able to carry on it a oriach. Now these names of bricks we have also in the beginning of Bava Basra, just to say that the bricks that they used in the times of Chazal were 3 tefach wide bricks. The oriach is a half a brick. A half a brick is a tefach and a half. If you remember, we learned this in the beginning of Eruvin. Guys, when you have a brick that's a tefach and a half, and the koira upon which you're putting it is only 1 tefach, it's fully okay. Because the difference between the width of the koira and the brick and the oriyach and the half a brick is a half a tefach. If you divide it by putting a quarter of a tefach, which is 1 finger breadth on one side, and a quarter on the other side, so there's a little bit of a overlap, it's protruding a little bit from both sides, it's perfectly okay. So now the Braisa is going to speak about a scenario where the koira did not have the thickness of a tefach, which is what we would like for it to have. But you had 2 narrow koiros, but you put them one touching the other. They're both running together. The shnei koiros, and they're called hamas imois, right? 2 narrow strips, but they are lying side by side. However, even though each one by themselves, the amount of width that it needs to have on it an oriyach, like we just mentioned, even though the oriyach is a tefach and a half, is 1 tefach. That means even though neither one in by themselves have the width of a tefach, but says the Braisa, if when they are laid together, if they're running together, they're touching each other, they're not overlapping each other, but they're running across together. If they can together carry the oriyach, which means together, if you measure the width of the koira, both together, you have the width of a tefach, then again you're good. Ein tzarich lavi koira acheres. Right, this double koira is good. However, v'im lav, but if combined, you don't have a tefach, the chachamim hold, then tzarich lavi koira acheres. You have to, because without the minimum width, I don't care putting 2 together. I don't care putting 3 together. As long as all together they're touching each other, and all together you have less than that, it's not good. And here again, Rashbag is more lenient. Now, listen to this, guys. Even though I'll explain it first by heart. Even though they're together, what were to happen if you were to separate them, and instead of laying the brick, and again the oriyach is a tefach and a half, but the length of the oriyach is the same length of a full brick, it's also 3 tefachim. So if you were to take these 2 koiros and separate them and lay the brick lengthwise, which means that you want one end of 1 koira and the other end of 1 koira to have total 3 tefachim, which means there'll be a gap in between the 2 koiros. Now, what's stopping you of doing that? You can always separate 2 things and keep the periphery of both 3 tefachim apart. Of course, the question here, according to the Rashbag, is it physically strong enough to hold the oriyach, which is laid lengthwise? So even if it doesn't have a width of a tefach, as long as if you were to place a oriyach lengthwise, which means you want to have the total distance, including the koiros of 3 tefachim, if it won't break from the weight, it's also good inside. Rashbag oimer im MERCAVA oriyach lo orkoi, as long as if you were to separate it, and you would now lay this half a brick to the length of the half a brick, which means you're looking to cover a space of 3 tefachim, which is shloisha tefachim. And again, and what? Well, you can have something as skinny as a rope, and you can separate it that totally it should be 3 tefachim apart, but it's going to be very, very flimsy. But if it will be strong enough to hold this oriyach place la'arkoi, it's also good. Ein tzarich lavi koira acheres. But v'im lav, but if it's not going to be strong enough, then again, tzarich lavi koira acheres. So he's a little bit more lenient. Now, Chevra, let's go weiter in the Braisa. Here we go. Here will be the case in the Braisa that's mamish connected to the Mishnah and Alois and to our Mishnah. What happens, again, you're looking for a koira for it to have the minimum width of a tefach. Or according to the Rashbag, that if you were to separate it and to leave it within the 3 tefachim and it's strong enough, whatever you need to have, you did not lay this double koira on the same level. You had 2 koiras, neither is a tefach width. One is lower and one is vertically higher to the side. They're not over each other. They are staggered again. Again, chavoy tremi or lavud. Lavud everyone agrees to always. Whether you're going to use chavoy tremi. So says the Mishnah, Hoya achas lamayla va'achas lamata. Again, it's not one directly above the other, but it's if they would have been on the same level, they would have been masimais. They would have been running side by side. But then one is up and one is down. So Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Royin, right? Royin ho elyoino ki ilu hi lamata. Or similarly, ve'es atachtoina ki'ilu hi lamayla. And if they would be on the same level, would it be good? Well, according to the Tanach, then they would have to have a width of a tefach. According to the Rashbag, you don't need that to happen, even if it won't have the width of a tefach. You look at the other rule that we just learned above, as we look at it as if they're running side by side. And if running side by side would suffice, so then even though it's physically not side by side, royin. And now says the Braisa, ubilvad, but there are restrictions when it comes to a koira. What are those restrictions? That the one on the top should not be above 20 amas, because we don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. L'chachamim, that's the upper limit. And the hatachtoin, and the one on the bottom, should not be under 10 tfachim. L'kola alma, under that is also not a valid koira. And as long as they are all within the limitations of a koira, so royin. End of quote. All of this is Rav Ashi's kasha. What is this Braisa speaking about? Guys, if every koira would have a width of a tefach, you don't need to royin. You're good to go. This Braisa is dafka speaking about a koira who does not have a width of a tefach. And yet, it sounds like we're saying that if the one on the top is 20 amas or 19 amas, it's not above 20 amas. If the one on the bottom is 10 tfachim, that means there's a huge space vertically in between them. We say royin. That is chavoy tremi. Which implies, says the Gemara, Hozeh v'zeh b'toich esrim. B'toich esrim doesn't mean esrim. It means b'toich esrim amma and above 10 tfachim. We say chavoy tremi, even though this Braisa is clearly not speaking about aflagav deleis bei tefach. Now, Rav Ashi is not asking this as a contradiction between the din of Eruvin and the din in Ahalois. That's not a contradiction, because we can have this general concept of Chavoy Tremi that's said everywhere. However, its application when it comes to Tumas oil, there's a unique halacha l'meishumi Sinai, consistent with an oil to begin with is only if it has a tefach. It's only applied if there's a tefach. When it comes to a koida, it's the whole din of koida is only din d'Rabbanan, right? We don't have this limitation of a tefach. We are, so this is a kula over here. We say chavoy tremi, even if it doesn't have a tefach. So since we don't use the din of a tefach in other areas other than in ahalois, why are you limiting the schach to the tefach? That's the kasha that Rav Ashi asks. And to that, Amalei. So Rav Ashi is asking it to Rav Kahana because he only heard Rava's opinion from Rav Kahana. So Rav Kahana, defending Rava, tells Rav Ashi, no. Let me tell you how Rava would understand this Braisa by the Koiros. That Teritz, the Eimahachi, this is what's happening over there. For sure, the Braisa that we just quoted has nothing to do with Chavoy Tremi, because we're speaking about a Koira that doesn't have the Tefach width. The Braisa is only using Royin connected to Lavud. The Braisa spoke about a case that it's 20 amas and 10 tfachim. Now, the top one has to be b'toich esrim. And in that case, where the top skinny koira is mamish by the upper limit, but not above it, the one underneath it is within 3 tvachim. How? Pachos mishloisha. Or according to the Rashbag, pachos ma'arba. Or the Braisa says, inami, that if the bottom one is by the max of the lower limit, but it's good, it's 10 tvachim. Asara tvachim. Right? Elo lamayla ma'asara. Right? So you have a gap underneath the kite of 10 tvachim, which is the minimum. And in that case, when do we say royin? Also love it. If the higher kaita is within 3 tvachim above it, the Elyahu and Samuchal b'pachas v'shleisha. But indeed, the way Rava will understand pshat in this braisa, avol shleisha, the moment that the vertical gap in between these two kaitas is 3 or more, so then kiven the leis beit tefach, since there is no tefach, we can lo yomrin on chavoy tremi. Very good. I like Tzvika's question, and why Abaye did not know of chavoy tremi. Interestingly, just to know in halacha, just to see that we paskin like Abaye for sure, because we paskin lavut, and also we paskin like And also we paskin like Rava. We say Chavoy to me. Or just to know, that's a new halacha. But it has to work in a way where it's staggered, and we lowered the top one, as long as physically, if we were to physically lower it, it would fit tight or comfortably or very comfortably, but it has to fit in between the space, the gaps in the lower one. All right. Says the Gemara weiter. Whether the next line, Lerav, is an explanation of the Sukah Hamid Duvlelis, or according to Shmuel, whether this is a new halacha. The halacha is that you need to have schach shetzilasa meruba mechamos, that it creates more shade than sunlight. And now we have a classical piece of Gemara. If you remember, the last halacha we learned on Sukah Daf Beis, the last halacha in Sukah Daf Beis was this in the reverse. Going back, it says in the Mishnah that shechamasa meruba mitzilasa, that if there's more sunlight than shade, it's psula. And both of these clauses, they don't back each other up. They contradict each other. Because when you have more sunlight than shade, or if you have more shade than sunlight, what happens if it's exactly the same? And the inference, the in between the lines of both of these clauses contradict each other. Hold on. Are you telling me that you have to have more shade than sunlight, which implies that ki adadi, if it would be exactly the same, then psula. Okay. Now, b'hatanan, we learned the be'idach perikin, we look like we just quoted the last clause of the first Mishnah, the first Perek. The Mishnah says that if there's more sunlight, v'shechamasa, more than shade, the Mishnah says psula. What does that imply? That ki adadi, as long as they are the same, it's kosher. How do you resolve this contradiction of implication? Answers the Gemara. This is very important. Kan means over here, our Mishnah, which what do we imply? That ki hadadi, that if it's exactly half and half, the Mishnah seems to be saying that it's puzzle. Yes. You know when? When you are looking not on the floor of the sukkah, but you are looking at the level of the schach. If at the level of the schach, it's exactly half and half, and as we spoke about in the introduction, this concept that sunlight, as it spreads further from its source, right, it covers more area. If at the schach level it's 50-50, fashtetzach, that on the ground of the sukkah there will be more sun than more sunlight than shade. Gewaldik. And however, Kan, which is going back to the first Mishnah, there the Mishnah that says that what? That if there is more sunlight than shade, it's possible. And what does that imply? That if it's 50-50, it's kosher. I don't know. All right. You know why? Because we are speaking about milmata. If it's 50-50 milmata, you know what that means? It means that on the schach level, there is more shade than sunlight. Because sunlight, the farther away from its source, the more it spreads. You would think that if the source is farther away, oy gewalt, the opposite. The farther something goes,
schach is less than 50-50, but down on the bottom it's more than 50-50.
No, if the schach is less than, make it clear, if sunlight or shade. Danny, you became muted.
I'm saying up top, there's more sunlight and less shade. But down,
no, that's not good. If it's more sunlight, you mean the opposite. If it's more, even if on top it's 50-50, it's already not good.
Spreads, right? You're saying the shade spreads.
No, the sunlight spreads. The sunlight
spreads.
No, Danny's question is the discussion of all the Rishonim. Danny's, it's just in the reverse. Your question is the same question. What happens that if you have, no, it's, are we looking be'ikid at the top or in the bottom? And that's a big stira that people ask from Rashi, but at least the concept is beautiful. That's light. The further from the source, the more space it occupies. And let's read it inside. And that's the pshat of the statement. Amarav Papa, Hainu Keda Amri Inshi, that kizuz, guys, there's a coin known as a zuz, which is a relatively smaller coin, and the istara was a larger coin. So he's speaking about the schach, that if there is an opening in the schach, if there's sunlight, if there's a gap in the schach in the size of a zuz, If you look at that same amount of sunlight on the bottom, it's going to already become the size of an istira. Kezuza mila'el, ke istira milatachas. Just to mention that today is our Rabbi Yaakov Shalman's father, Rabbi Mordechay ben Michal's yard site.
Michal ben Mordechay.
Michal ben Mordechay, thank you. So Michal, we say by a yard site that the neshama should have an aliyah. You know, people go about having an aliyah means that the neshama goes to a higher level. It doesn't mean that they go farther away from us. They have an aliyah, but fakert, now their light goes even more over here. Gavaldik. And let the last thing of the Mishnah. Mu'uva kein bayis. If the sukkah is thickly covered, mamish like a house, meaning the Mishnah says that you can't even see the stars. Let's go to more details. So far as what we learned in the Mishnah, if you don't see the stars, kshedo. That's according to everyone. But now, what happens if it's even more thickly covered? What's koich vechama? Rashi says, sun rays. If it's so thickly covered, it's during the day, and the sun rays don't go through it at all, so maybe that's already a bias. And indeed, Beis Shammai say it's possible. Because the words of the Mishnah was, if it's kemin bias, it's okay. But if it's bias mamish, not. This was made only for a sukkah, I don't care. Don't forget, Beis Shammai, b'chlal, it has to be made l'shem mitzvah sukkah. You can't make it just because you have in mind l'shem sukkah and make a covering a house. Beis Hillel still say that it's kosher. That even if sun rays don't go through it, you made this is not your bias. Now the big topic of discussion is what happens if it's so thick that rain doesn't go through it. That's a bigger madrega. No, the consensus will be that there comes a point where we view the covering, the schach, as a bias. The moment it becomes bias, there's going to be a problem. Okay, let's go weiter. We have time. Let's start the new Mishnah. Now, just a point of reference, the last Mishnah we had on Daf Chafalo from Mid Beis that spoke about someone that puts a schach around bedposts. And we had in the Gemara a machlokas amaroim. Why does Rabbi Yehuda passel it? And the first explanation was because she'ein loy keva. So we said that if a sukkah is so not fixed, Rabbi Yehuda passels it. But just understand like this: when you have the walls of the sukkah are so movable that you can easily move it, that according to Rabbi Yehuda is a problem. When you are moving that sukkah, you're not moving the floor with it, you're just moving the bedposts. Here the Mishnah is beginning with scenarios that the sukkah is taka not fixed in its location. It's metaltel. But when you are metaltel it, everything moves. That's a lesser of a problem. And what would that be? The two famous cases. If you build a sukkah on top of a agola, on top of a wagon, right, what we call today a sukkah mobile, or if you build it beroish hasfina. Now, understand the issue with the sfina isn't only that the sfina could move on the water, but it's exposed to the wind and it can be blown down easier than a sukkah that's built on ground. In other words, there's a certain amount of flimsiness or there's a certain amount of movability, of a lack of fixedness. Here the Mishnah says, nevertheless, it's kosher. And I'm reading inside the Rashi, 4 lines under the Gemara, the diras arai sagiba. And there's a big question whether Rashi is implying that according to Rabbi Yehuda, maybe not. Rabbi Yehuda wants a sukkah to be like a diras kava. Is this subject to the machlokes tanoim? Is it not? That's l'chayr, a big machlokes rishonim. And now let's go weiter. Says the Mishnah, now that we paskin that it's kosher, there is no prohibition to go on a wagon on Shabbos and Yontiv. There's no prohibition of going on top of a boat on Shabbos and Yontiv. Not only is it kosher, but for oilen lo b'yomtiv. Now, there's no chiddush in this, but the Mishnah is just setting itself up to contrast it with the next in. What happens, b'roisha ilan, if you build a sukkah on top of a tree? The floor is on top of a tree. Midrabanan, you may not climb a tree on Shabbos. You might break a twig. As well as midrabanan, you may not ride on an animal. Oil gabagomol. So the sukkah per se is kosher, but ve'ein oilen la b'yomtiv. Because midrabanan, you can't go on an animal, you can't go on a tree. Says Gavaldik, says Rashi, that when it says ksheda, so ksheda means, right, 7 lines under the Gemara, l'choyloi shel mayit. Now Rashi adds a one-liner. Va'af biyamtiv. If, God forbid, a person violated the rabbinic law, im avad va'alala, still yotza yedei chayvasai. Hupa. Mitzvah baba veda.
Why would you say ksheda? It's like listening ivir. You can't tell somebody it's kosher and then they'll think and they'll climb up on the tree or the animal and they would just be neveda.
Because so ksheda means use it for chol hamoed. Use it for chol hamoed. People know you can't go on a tree on Yom Tov. They know that. And what Rashi is adding in, if someone actually went there, they're going to be yoitz.
Even though it's a mitzvah baba veda.
Oh, so guys, we quoted, if you remember, in Daf Tes, I think. I think it's Tes Amadal. If you remember, we learned the Tosfos together because it's a very quoted Tosfos. The last Tosfos in the Amid, that Tosfos says that the problem of mitzvah baba veda is only a rabbinic problem. And therefore, on a biblical level, you'll be yoitz Sukah. Many also are machalik tzemach between if the cheftza is a problematic sukkah, like it's a stolen, or whether the sukkah is kosher, the gavra was oived on not climbing on a tree. That will also be less problematic. That's a big talk over here. Now, let's go into details, just finish up the Mishnah. It's very simple. I'll say all it by heart. What happens if a sukkah is partially leaning on a tree, but it's partially leaning on a standalone board? What is the point that we say it's enough not on the tree for you to be allowed to go on it, and vice versa? What's the point that even though it has some other support, but it's not enough? So says the Mishnah, if two of the walls are resting on the tree, and one wall is bidei adam, that means roiv on a tree, or even if shtayim bidei adam, but one wall is still resting on a tree. Here again, even though the sukkah itself is kosher, but the ein oilon la b'yantiv, because you need the tree for the sukkah to stand. Here, whoever can see the picture can notice that's the case where there's only one wall that is standing on the floor, and that is the third wall, but two of the walls are fully resting on the tree. However, the last case in the Mishnah, which is not on the picture, if all three, there's a sukkah, four walls, and you don't need four walls, and three of them are b'nei adam, even though achas be'ilan, then not only is it kosher, but v'oilon b'yantiv. It makes a lot of sense. Why? So the Mishnah says, Daf Chav Gimel, Zaklal, Kol she'yinatel ha'ilan. If you would remove the tree, and therefore the wall that the tree, or the walls that the tree is supporting, if after removing all that, still v'yechoyla la'amod b'fnei atzma, it would be able to stand without the tree support. Let me just add something. And you would have enough walls. You don't need to have four walls. You don't even need to have three full walls. But you will have enough wall. Physically, it won't fall down. And you have what you need. Then it's kosher and v'oilon la b'yantiv. Unlike the two cases the Mishnah gave, that if you would remove the tree, either the whole sukkah would collapse, or obviously you won't have walls, then the sukkah is still kosher, but the oilon la b'yantiv, God willing, to be continued.